And good afternoon. My name is Tara Kraft. I am the Secretary for the Association of Graduate Art Students, and I'm so excited to welcome you all to the first day of graduate presentations for the Emerging Scholars Symposium, Visualizing Identity, Exploring Dimensions of the Self Through Art, hosted in partnership by the Association of Graduate Art Students and the Georgia Museum of Art. Before we begin our first session today, I'd like to acknowledge and thank the Lamar Dodd School of Art and the Franklin College of Arts and Sciences for their financial support of our symposium. I'd also like to thank Dr. William Elan, the director of the Georgia Museum of Art, as well as Dr. Isabel Wallace, the head of the graduate program at the Lamar Dodd School of Art. I'd like to also thank our faculty advisor, Dr. Janice Simon, for her guidance and wisdom throughout this process and development of the Emerging Scholars Symposium. And many thanks to Dr. Callan Steinman, the Curator of Education at the Georgia Museum of Art, who has been instrumental in the logistics and organization of our event today. We would also like to thank Dr. Shania Harris, the Larry D. and Brenda A. Thompson Curator of African American and African Diasporic Art, who curated the Emma Amos Color Odyssey exhibition that our symposium is held in conjunction with. I would also like to thank my other co-chairs for this symposium for all of their collaborative work and support as we have worked on this event today, Charlotte Gaye, Francesca Felicella, and Noah Dassinger. There has been a shift in our schedule for Saturday's sessions. Unfortunately, with the inclement weather in Texas, Kirsten Jacobson is unable to present her research on the identities of power from the late antique Roman Empire. Caroline Fucci will now be presenting at 12:45 during the first session on Saturday. And our first session today will include two papers that focus on 20th century representations of identity across various mediums, including literature and photography. Our first speaker today is Victoria Horrocks from Oxford University. Victoria is a Master of Studies candidate studying the history of art and visual culture. Her paper today is titled Artistic Sisterhood, Reimagining Gender and Identity in the Domestic Space. I will now invite Victoria to the presentation, and I'll hand things over to her. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara, for that introduction, and also to Callan for all of her help with the tech and organizing the symposium for today. Also, big thank you to Charlotte, Francesca, and Noah, and Tara again for organizing this symposium on such a rich topic, which resonates with research and ideas that I've been using over for a long time. And I'm very excited to be in conversation with the other upcoming papers. My research interests are centered on 20th century art and literature, image-text relationships, and theories of display. And my talk today is largely based on my undergraduate thesis, which I've been building on throughout my master's degree at Oxford. My paper, Artistic Sisterhood, Reimagining Gender and Identity in the Domestic Space, will address feminism and gender in modern art and literature through an intermedial analysis of the artistic sisterhood between Virginia Woolf and Vanessa Bell. In both subject and form, Vanessa Bell's painting and Virginia Woolf's writing explore their identities as modern women. Looking at their respective art and literature, we see the sisters engage with and convey common lived experiences. Beyond being sisters, Bell and Woolf were close confidants and integral members of the Bloomsbury Group, a collective of art and literature creatives and friends who banded together in the early 20th century. When they weren't living together, Woolf and Bell often wrote letters to one another, each sister confiding in the other and consulting on their developing work, both artistic and literary. They also publicly praised one another's work. Woolf, for example, wrote the foreword to a publication by the London Artists Association in 1930 titled Recent Paintings by Vanessa Bell, in which she commends her sister for both her painting and her identity as an artist and a modern woman. She writes, Belle has looked on nakedness with a brush in her hand. She is reported, one has read it in the newspapers, to be the most considerable painter of her own sex now alive. For whatever the phrase may mean, it must mean that her pictures stand for something, are something, and be something which we shall disregard at our peril. This nakedness that Woolf refers to here codifies a sense of vulnerability. It is a creative commitment to revealing something, bearing witness to a previously hidden aspect of a subject. It is this exposing of her subject's nakedness that not only labels Belle the most considerable painter of her own sex now alive, as Woolf quotes, but determines that her pictures stand for something. I find the repetition of this phrase curious. It seems to me that the tense change lends Belle's work a life and a future beyond the present. Her works both stand for something and are something in and of themselves in the present, but they will also be something in the future as time passes. In the broader context of Bloomsbury creative philosophy, standing for something meant recognizing and displaying an inner truth. Woolf's fiction frequently explores the internal lives of her characters, from her protagonist, Clarissa Dalloway in Mrs. Dalloway, to the characters Lily Briscoe and Mrs. Ramsay in To the Lighthouse, two of Woolf's notably feminist novels. Approximately 10 years earlier, Belle began wrestling with the same concept of a subject's inner life in her early painting, and continued developing these concepts specifically in her portraiture and self-portraiture up until her death in 1961. In 1912, Belle's work was displayed at the second Post-Impressionist exhibition put on by another integral member of the Bloomsbury group, artist Roger Fry, who organized the exhibition to stake a claim that Post-Impressionism had made its way to England, and that the English artists exhibited in it were solidly of the movement. Belle's husband, art critic and Bloomsbury member Clive Bell, wrote in the exhibition catalog that the work of the English painters are of the movement because in choice of subject, they recognize no authority but the truth that is in them. In reaction to this revelation of inner truth, which can be defined by the subject's private life, their emotions and identities, Belle famously wrote in her essay, Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, that human character changed. This change in character marked the cultural shift, moving from Victorian life and culture fraught with questions of morality, authority, and the nation to a more modern one. Woolf, Belle, and their contemporaries insist that this modern character is post-impressionist and concerned with the individual, with the self, and the various identities by which it is constituted. In their respective art and literature, Belle and Woolf center this myriad self, and in doing so, pioneer what it means to be a woman of the modern era. Historian and writer Samuel Hines writes that conventional standards of behavior which had developed from the evangelical ethics of a century earlier had become rigid and empty gestures of decorum. Important not because they implied a moral rightness, but because they seemed to protect social stability, public morals, religion, and the British Empire against the threat of change. While I want to acknowledge Bloomsbury's steep colonial history and class pretensions, Woolf and Belle position themselves in opposition to this moral and social rigidity of the Victorian era. The Victorian way of life forced both women to suppress their emotions and identities to parade as dutiful housewives. In resistance, Woolf and Belle insisted on putting emotional expression at the forefront of their lives. They rejected conventional family structures and traditional gender roles, welcomed unaccepted sexualities and political beliefs, and expressed this dynamic self in their creative work. Woolf and Belle would not just be wives and mothers. They would also be lovers, artists, writers, friends, advocates, pioneers, and more. We will begin exploring the ways in which each woman addresses this complicated self through fraught, if often subtle, explorations of their inner lives. beginning with the portrayal of Woolf through Belle's portraits of her sister, and concluding with Woolf's portrayal of Belle as Lily Briscoe and Mrs. Ramsay in To the Lighthouse, we will see the ways in which each sister reveals the complicated and multifaceted nature of the self, which corresponds with what I'm identifying as the inner private life of the subject. Central components to this inner life are emotions, impressions, and feelings. In a letter to Leonard Woolf dated January 22nd, 1913, Belle writes, "The reason I think that artists paint life and not patterns is that certain qualities of life, what I call movement, mass, weight, have aesthetic value. Clive says one gets the same emotion from flat patterns that one does from pictures. I say one doesn't, because of the reason I have just given, that movement, etc., give me important aesthetic emotions." In this letter, Belle underscores an essential characteristic of her work, this appeal to what she calls aesthetic emotions, meaning the emotions and feelings conveyed through a painting. She also identifies that she's painting life, and that life constitutes movement, mass, and weight, all concepts that elicit a dynamism and a shifting of perspectives. When we look at her 4 portraits of Woolf completed in 1912, we can see how Belle captures Woolf's inner life through her use of significant form. Belle toys with line and shape, uses bold colors and oversimplification, and ultimately breaks from Victorian convention to portray Woolf as she was, a modern woman caught in a tense conflict between the dynamic and emotional inner self and the morally and socially rigid culture of their historical moment. The series of 4 portraits of Woolf by Belle, all titled Virginia Woolf, was displayed in the catalog to the exhibition titled Vanessa Belle at the Dulwich Picture Gallery in 2017. Although all were completed in 1912, it is unclear whether these portraits were painted in this particular order, but organized as such, Dulwich's figuring of the series offers a possible way of framing Belle's exploration of her sister's identity. These portraits speak to the multitude of selves that Woolf similarly evokes in her novels, the external or social selves that might be forced to conform to societal convention that come into conflict with the internal selves that exhibit contrary states of being. In this first portrait of Woolf, Belle portrays her sister most clearly compared to the other 3. The portrait is identifiably her sister, and we can discern Woolf's facial and bodily expression. There's a stiffness to her body positioning, and the hands at the base of the portrait appear to be clenched. Woolf's hunched posture and the tension in her facial expression all relay an anxiety. Her lips are parted as if she's trying to speak, but the tension expressed in the painting convinces the observer she cannot. There's a forced silence of the sitter in this portrait that elicits a sort of suppression that parallels concession of the internal self to the external one. While Woolf's facial expression remains clear, the thick, wide brushstrokes of her hand resist form and detail, and her sweater blends into the nondescript background behind her, delineated only by the thin black line contouring Woolf's frame. Note these colors of blue, green, and teal, which appear significantly in the coming portraits as well. Moving into the second portrait of Woolf, Belle portrays her sister in the same green and blue sweater, but rather than sitting rigidly upright, Woolf is slouched into an armchair. Where her face was once sharply defined, eyes wide and attentive, her face is now blurred, replaced with thick brushstrokes and blotches of color. While the title assures that this is Woolf, without further indication, this figure is not identifiably Belle's sister. In such a position, sinking into her armchair and resisting definition, it appears as if Woolf is almost dissolving into her background, and the brush strokes across her face suggest an intentional blurring of her eyes and mouth. Angled as it is, looking from slightly above, this perspective offers us a closeness to Woolf. Her body leans to the right, positioning her that much closer to the observer as though she is leaning in towards us. Thus, there is a kind of intimacy evoked in her body language here that fuels this private revelation of Woolf's character. In this instance, then, we see Belle play with the genre of portraiture while she lends it a modern or post-impressionist twist. Seeing that the genre of portraiture traditionally aims to capture something of the essence or true life of the sitter, Belle forces us to realize that this essence of Woolf is one that does not match her external self. Instead, it is something messier, more evocative, and more blurred. Ironically, this portrayal of Woolf's truer self obfuscates the features by which one would have identified her, insisting that the external or social self is perhaps connected to, but not representative of, the internal self. The third portrait in the series takes a more dramatic break from traditional form, and Woolf becomes even less identifiable. While Woolf is sitting in the same armchair as the second portrait and wearing the same clothes as the first and second, here she has no discernible facial features. Save for what appears to be 2 blotches of blue where eyes might be, although we know Woolf to have brown eyes from the first portrait. The thin black line that delineates her frame in each portrait is more faded here, especially in contrast to the bold, active brushstrokes that surround them on the chair, background, and Woolf's clothes. The color and shape of her hair also blur with the texture and shade of the chair, conjuring an experience of dissolution into the background in this third portrait. Belle's use of oversimplification and exaggeration take the tension of the first portrait and the resistance to definition of the second and make them even more noticeable. There is a chaos to this portrait that fittingly takes place within the confines of the home. While Victorian convention dictated the domestic space to be one of suppression for women, where one would be relegated to the needs of men and social duty, Woolf and Belle both challenged this notion in their modern lives. Instead, they saw the home as a space where one could more easily and safely reveal one's private internal life. This context makes clear this new association with the domestic space, since the armchair we see in the second and third portraits firmly locate Woolf within the home, and it is in this domestic setting that Belle portrays her sister's most chaotic inner life. Taking a step back, it might even seem that this portrait is unfinished or in its early stages of creation, affirming the frenetic energy that might suggest Belle stopped in the middle of this work, in the middle of a dynamic moment of creative thought. As a result, Woolf too appears simultaneously static and in motion, perhaps caught between expression and suppression. In the fourth portrait of Woolf, Belle's portrayal of her sister differs from the previous 3. Although she mirrors the slouched and closed-off body language of the first 3 portraits, she sits outside this time and forgoes her armchair for a deck chair. She now wears a purple dress with red and white accents rather than her blue and green sweater. And while the lines and forms in the portrait are more clear and representational, this time Woolf's face is obscured completely. Not even blotches of blue like we saw in the third portrait. As in the second and third portraits, one would not know this was Woolf except for the portrait's title. This time, Woolf is more relaxed, leaning back resolutely in her deck chair. But to me, this moment of leisure evokes an impenetrability. While arguably the most cohesive portrait, we are given the least detail in Woolf's face while outside in the garden, a perhaps more public setting compared to the private setting of the domestic space we saw in the second and third portraits. Once outside, the external self dominates, and we lose access to Woolf's chaotic inner life that Belle began to reveal to us. Through these portraits, I argue that Belle reveals her sister's multiplicity of selves. In quite a literal way, we have 4 different portrayals of Woolf, but we also see the ways Belle endows her sister with a plurality of self and a complex internal character in each singular painting. In her series, Belle delivers portraits of Woolf's internal consciousness through a rupturing of traditional line, color, and form. She also acknowledges this fraught, ambivalent relationship to the domestic space while displaying the tension between the internal and external selves and insisting that the internal reigns supreme in all its dynamism, chaos, and complexities. At the opening of this talk, I briefly mentioned Woolf's novel, Mrs. Dalloway, and in particular, Woolf's construction of interiority via her character, Clarissa Dalloway. I want to now turn to a passage in the novel that parallels Bell's characterization of Woolf. A semi-autobiographical current courses through Clarissa, and this moment early in the text clues the reader into this exploration of selves that Bell ultimately shows us in her portraiture. As Clarissa looks into a mirror in her dressing room, she confronts the dynamism of her inner life. She pursed her lips together when she looked in the glass. It was to give her face point. That was herself, pointed, dart-like, definite. That was herself when some effort, some call on her to be herself drew the parts together. She alone knew how different, how incompatible and composed, so for the world only into one center. One diamond, one woman who sat in her drawing room and made a meeting point. A radiancy, no doubt, in some dull lives, never showing a sign for all the other sides of her, faults, jealousies, vanities, suspicions. As Clarissa looks at herself in the mirror, she makes invisible what is inherently unseen, but to do so requires the immense labor of emotional suppression. To deny the parts of her identity that remain internalized throughout the novel, Clarissa draws her many selves to a singular point, that being her apparent social self, which stands in contrast to her interior selves. One that remains in love with her old lover, Peter Walsh, one that recalls the sexual passion she felt for Sally Seton, one that experiences profound emptiness in her marriage, and one who feels neglected by the social convention that binds her to her present reality. What the narrator excludes or glosses over in this textual moment is the emptiness that Clarissa expresses at the end of the novel, and what Bell evokes in the blank, expressionless face of Woolf in that fourth portrait. Returning to a quote from Samuel Hines I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, that emptiness of Victorian social convention, which despite its representation is a lack of substance, here wields itself both in portraiture and prose as oppression based on gender and sexuality. Of course, Woolf faced similar suppressions of identity. While she was married to her husband, Leonard, Woolf had a decade-long affair with writer Vita Sackville-West, which began in 1925, the same year Mrs. Dalloway was published. Woolf writes bisexuality, albeit subtly, into the character of Clarissa, and while the topics of gender, sexuality, and identity were often explored in the Bloomsbury group, with many of its members identifying across the spectrum of sexual orientation, Woolf's own sexuality was still illegal in Britain until 1967, many years after her suicide in 1941. This context further engages this tension between the external and the internal, seeing that Woolf would have had to publicly hide her sexuality. Evoking that composed yet incompatible portrayal of Clarissa that Bell preempts in her portrayal of Woolf's composure and resistance in the first and fourth portraits. In contrast, portraits 2 and 3 implore a revelation of inner life, the expression of other selves and many facets of the self that flow lucidly in the narration of Woolf's novel. These moments of expression are what ultimately define and characterize Bell's portraits of Woolf, this urge to express, to open up, and reveal the inner life, but which is ultimately stifled, if only partly, gaining access to these inner truths only within the private domestic space and the intimacy of portraiture between sisters. Mrs. Dalloway and Bell's portraiture are just two examples of this exposure of the multiple selves I've outlined so far. Woolf's novel, The Waves, follows the consciousness of 5 friends and addresses the multiplicity of selves in each character, protagonist Bernard notably saying, "I am more selves than they think. We are not simple as our friends would have us." In her novel Orlando, which is subtitled A Biography, Woolf explores gender through her protagonist who turns from man to woman within the novel. In Woolf's immensely visual prose, these novels seem to paint literary portraits of their protagonist, exploring the tensions of the selves, just as Bell explored those of Woolf's in the portraits we've looked at. In another of Woolf's feminist novels, To the Lighthouse, Woolf paints what I'm calling literary portraits of Vanessa Bell in the characters of Lily Briscoe and Mrs. Ramsay. Throughout the novel, Lily Briscoe, a resolutely post-impressionist painter, wonders whether or not she should live in accordance with Victorian convention, meaning dutiful wife and mother, suppressed and stifled like the other female protagonist, Mrs. Ramsay. In the final scene of the novel, Lily completes her painting and famously thinks to herself, "I have had my vision," suggesting that painting is not just an act of expression, but of self-revelation. The narrator writes of something she remembered in the relations of those lines cutting across, and muses about the way painting is like untying the knot of imagination. Returning to Woolf's quotation I began with in Recent Paintings by Vanessa Bell, which asserted that Bell's paintings stand for something. That active message is this unknotting by which we come to access the creative imagination and ultimately our many selves. In another quotation in Recent Paintings by Vanessa Bell, Woolf writes, "Miss Bell is a woman," and then halfway round the room one says, "But she may be a man." One says, "She is interested in children." One has to add, "But she is equally interested in rocks." One asks, "Does she show any special knowledge of clothes?" One replies, "Stark nakedness seems to please her as well." Is she dainty then, or austere? Is she, for our patience is becoming exhausted, not a woman at all, but a mixture of goddess and peasant, treading the clouds with her feet and with her hands shelling peas? Notably, what Woolf commends in her sister in this quotation is a refusal to abide by traditional artistic gender norms, and in doing so, she lends her sister an androgyny that she deeply admires. She applauds both Bell's femininity and her masculinity, and the proverbial nakedness of vulnerable interiority that I raised at the beginning of this talk. And this oscillation between man and woman affirms the same multiplicity of selves that Bell paints in Woolf. But most importantly, Woolf remarks a resistance to definition in Bell. This resistance to definition mirrors that in her second and third portraits of her sister, putting their works in intimate dialogue with one another. Both sisters, in their strident gender politics and insistence on cultural transgression, reimagine gender roles and norms within their domestic spaces. Seeing the home as a space of creativity and self-expression, Bell often painted interiors of her home and of her studios. I've included here a view of the pond at Charleston and 8 Fitzroy Street as 2 examples. Charleston being Bell's home, where nearly all the members of the Bloomsbury Group took up residence at some point in their friendship, and 8 Fitzroy Street being the site of one of Bell's studios. These interiors complicate the traditional domestic space by fusing genre, breaking artistic convention with post-impressionist style, and by including coded messages about Bell's marriage and love life. For example, in 8 Fitzroy Street, Bell uses still life to focus on individual objects, including a small painting of a mother and child and a wood table. This small painting is a recreation of a painting by her good friend and lover, Duncan Grant, who ultimately fathered her daughter, Angelica, while she was married to Clive. Note how the painting reflects and refracts onto the table. The table, significantly a wedding present from her marriage to Clive, puts these 2 aspects of her identity, wife and lover, in conversation with one another. In these emblems of Bell's multiple selves, she projects a visual depiction of her complex identity. In view of the pond at Charleston, Bell fuses the genres of landscape painting and still life and creates an optical movement from indoors to outdoors, mirroring a dynamic movement from inner self to outer self and vice versa. In this self-portrait by Bell, we see many formal similarities to Bell's portraits of her sister completed 40 years earlier. Notably, we see a similar obstruction of facial expression and identifiable features. While the background of this 1952 portrait is cohesive and clear, Bell blurs her face with shadow and brushstroke. We sense a rigidity and a tension here, but Bell significantly portrays herself wielding her paintbrushes in hand with a tight grip of conviction. a strident symbol of self-expression and self-revelation a la Lily Briscoe into the lighthouse. To conclude, then, I want to return once more to Woolf's foreword in recent paintings by Vanessa Bell and re-examine the quotation where I began. Bell has looked on nakedness with a brush in her hand. She is reported, one has read it in the newspapers, to be the most considerable painter of her own sex now alive. For whatever the phrase may mean, it must mean that her pictures stand for something, are something, and be something which we shall disregard at our peril. I'm interested in this connection between inner life and its nakedness, its vulnerability, which must be protected and hidden behind clothes, metaphorical structures of culture and society. But I want to note this line, the most considerable painter of her own sex now alive, which would have been a hefty compliment in 1930, but with our 21st century lens, we can see as a judgment based on her gender identity. And while Virginia Woolf has amassed a prolific literary legacy, Vanessa Bell paled in comparison to her male contemporaries with time. Nonetheless, what is revealed about the experience of the modern woman in this dialogue between Bell's and Woolf's works, the existence and expression of multiple selves, the fraught relationship to the modern domestic space, and both sisters' complicated gender and sexual identities demands visibility and recognition. Although Bell's notoriety faded and nearly a century has passed since the publication of recent paintings, Woolf's words still ring true. For whatever the phrase may mean, it must mean that her pictures stand for something, are something, and be something, which we shall disregard at our peril. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Victoria, for this truly interdisciplinary analysis of identity and literature and painting. Just as a quick reminder, we will have a time for questions for Victoria following our next speaker, who I will now ask to join us. Our next speaker for today is Jessica Orzulak from Duke University. Jessica is a PhD candidate studying art history. Her paper today is titled Reiterations, Contemporary Photography and Rewriting Misappropriations of Identity. I will now hand things over to Jessica. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara, and thank you everyone for all of your work organizing this event. Visualizing identity can be a precarious enterprise. On the one hand, self-representation may be an empowering act. However, on the other, identities manufactured and imposed from without are often damaging both psychically and physically. The visual has long played an important role in how we establish and express identity in US cultures, a history that began well before the establishment of the United States as a nation and is tied up with how we define what it means to be human. In her essay, Unsettling the Coloniality of Being, Power, Truth, and Freedom, philosopher and cultural critic Sylvia Wynter traces a history of Western philosophical thought from the 16th century onwards, arguing that what it means to be human in the Euro-American sense has shifted from a Christian, theocentric subject to the rational self and political subject of the state, to the more recent purely biocentric and homo economicus form. She designates this definition of man with a capital M, differentiating Western ideological boundaries from other traditions, though she marks the idea of man as central to the project of colonialism. She argues the biocentric grounding continues to be expressed through discourses of race, sex, class, and gender that are conspicuously reliant on bodily and visual cues. Tellingly, these themes are also often central to questions of identity in the 20th and 21st centuries. One of the central iconographic origins of the visual definition and categorization of human beings through the lenses of race, sex, gender, and class have been the coterminous disciplines of anthropology and ethnography. In the US, early anthropology, which was fully embedded in the colonial project, focused much of its attention on American Indian nations. The camera was a fundamental tool in ethnography, which composed a hierarchical and racialized picture of humanity that posited a temporal distinction between indigenous and white bodies that figured American Indian peoples as fixed within a pre-modern past. The proliferation, drift, and commercialization of ethnographic photographs in popular culture has done much to form a generalized and monolithic simulacrum, posing as a pseudo-identity that has been superimposed over a multitude of diverse cultures, all the while shifting in meaning with the ideological needs of the national imaginary. This talk explores how the work of contemporary artists, Wendy Red Star, a member of the Absaloke Nation, Will Wilson, a member of the Diné Nation, Zig Jackson, who is of Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara descent, Stephen Paul Judd, who is Kiowa and Choctaw, and Nicholas Galanin, a member of the Tlingit Nation, incorporates and manipulates historic ethnographic photographs and photography as a medium in an effort to rewrite this history and claim their right to a visual and historical sovereignty. Their artworks appraise the misappropriation and commodification of images of Indigenous peoples in the spheres of academia, mass entertainment, and advertising, introducing personal memory and fostering cultural nuances that expand the images beyond their original purpose and use. A common theme that threads through many of these works is a consideration of silence and absence. Wendy Red Star's series, Let Them Have Their Voice, from 2016, introduces a tension between the two, addressing the absence of the voices of those pictured in the archive of ethnographic photographs. The series is a set of 15 objects made from the photographic prints of Crow chiefs taken by the well-known ethnographer Edward S. Curtis. His multi-volume series, The North American Indian, from 1907 to 1930, is in many ways the classic work of salvage ethnography in the American school. Salvage ethnography took as its premise the false assumption that American Indian peoples and cultures were destined to disappear and set out to record as much as possible for posterity's sake. It was also deeply intertwined with the government's goals of expelling Native American communities from their lands, even at the cost of genocide. Curtis's photographs of Native individuals have maintained an exaggerated presence in both the archive and popular culture. In the early 2000s, there was yet another resurgence of interest in his work. Between 2005 and 2009, a large-scale exhibition of his photographs showed internationally in at least 85 locations spanning the globe. The exhibition was organized and supported financially by the US Department of State and described by its curator, a major collector of Curtis photographs, Christopher Cardozo, as a celebration. Between 2015 and 19, there were at least 13 more large-scale exhibitions of Curtis's photographs in domestic locations. I don't want to spend too much time talking directly about Curtis himself. However, I do want to note that his photographs have a complicated legacy. Curtis himself saw his work as an act of critical preservation, and his photographs have been both lauded as some of the only widely accessible visual records available and deeply criticized for their approach to picturing Native communities. Curtis had a penchant for carrying sets of clothing from various nations and requesting sitters dress themselves with accoutrements from other cultural traditions, and taking an extremely active role in arranging how the sitters were photographed. The result being romanticized images that were used by the government and commercial entities alike to promote actions detrimental to the communities pictured while silencing those same groups. In fact, Let Them Have Their Voice was the result of a commission for an exhibition in Portland meant to respond to Curtis's exhibitions showing across the country. In the individual frames, Red Star methodically slices the subjects from their portraits, leaving behind only the silhouette of their figures. Each work is carefully matted and framed in the same fashion that the original prints are usually shown. In addition to the sculptural images, the installation included a soundtrack of wax cylinder recordings of crowmen singing taken by Curtis in the early 20th century. Red Star described the sound as almost haunting, but also very emotional. The act of hearing voices from individuals known to her family and community was intimate and offered more than was available in the original photographs. The works play on absence and presence. What do we see? What is actually present when the details of the figures' bodies are visible, particularly when those bodies have been racialized, but remains absent despite visibility? In the case of ethnographic imaging, with its established visual conventions, the voice of the photographer looms larger than that of those pictured. I want to be careful here not to suggest a lack of agency in the sitters. Describing them as merely shelves to be staged is itself a repetition of colonial violence. Yet because of the violent disruption of the cultures and communities the individuals belong to, and continued biases in history as a discipline, from archive to research to writing and publication, the voices of those pictured are often absent, leaving behind what is largely a colonial vision. And Let Them Have Their Voice, rather than adding sound to the visages of the men's faces, the singing voices suggest the importance of orality over the visual as a means of connecting with history. There's also something here that gestures to Edouard Glissant's writings about opacity. If the practice of looking has largely been co-opted within colonial structures of power, removing visuals that have been fetishized and forcing attention to the absence of content becomes an act of authority. It also signals that the absence of content may even extend to the images themselves, by which I mean the popular representations and not the real people pictured are empty vessels, mirroring certain desires and beliefs back at the society producing them. The performance of cutting away rather than adding to the violence then becomes an act of care and protection. The physical alteration of photographs is a method also taken up by Nicholas Galanin. His photo montage, Things Are Looking Native, Natives Looking Whiter, combines a press image of the Star Wars character Princess Leia with a photograph captioned by Curtis as a Tewa girl taken in 1906. The squash blossom hairstyle on the young woman is mirrored on actress Carrie Fisher. While Fisher as Leia is highly recognizable, the young Hopi Tewa woman on the left is anonymous. Her anonymity is reflective of the intention behind the picture. Her image was meant to represent a type that could be fitted into a neat category. Leia too may be understood as a symbolic type, but she is one that holds a different kind of imaginative power. The work illustrates the ways that Indigenous culture is appropriated and commodified by film, fashion, and advertising industries. Culturally significant practices are emptied of meaning and purpose and propagated in meaning as forms of decoration, away from consumers to fashion their own identities through commodity objects. The emptiness of the backgrounds is common to both ethnographic and fashion photography and supports the delinking of specific meanings from historical context. The blank spaces instill a sense of placelessness as well as timelessness. That removal of the figures from a distinct context intensifies the link to typological formations of time that permeate ethnological visuality. Typological time is determined in relation to sociocultural circumstances, such as pre-literate versus literate, or traditional versus modern, and so on. It is removed from the physical implications of moving through space and instead constituted by the overrepresentation of a particular condition of human experience. This formulation of the human experience is critically represented here as simultaneously split between the two women, but also merged as if part of a palimpsest. If, as Johannes Fabian has argued, the only way to be contemporary is to produce value in the capitalist system, the commodification and reduction of the image of a person or even the individual elements like a style of dress and hair to trend simultaneously allows the stereotyped native body to be brought into the present while also erasing the real bodies it signifies. Both images are images of fantasy, sold to the public for different reasons. They both emerge out of a discourse that removes the historic body and replaces it with simplified constructions, the idea of the native, the idea of the rebellious princess. Both characters are located in the same disembodied non-space-time of the imaginary, visualizes an emptiness in the images. The subject of popular cultural consumption is thematic in Galanin's work. He talks about it in terms of fetishization and dedicated a work meant to jolt the viewer to the problematic. In the same year as making Things Are Looking Native, he carved the likeness of a tool for male masturbation, often called a pocket pussy, from cedar, titling it, "I love your culture!" line woodworking. He writes, quote, that is named after the insistent claims of non-native individual consumers to whom the work is directed. And the fetishization of the pocket pussy as a small part removed from the physical, mental, and emotional wholeness of a person stands in for the small part of Pacific Northwest Indigenous culture that is fetishized and separated by non-Indigenous consumer culture, end quote. Though equally interested in consumer and popular culture, Stephen Paul Judd takes a decidedly more playful approach to historical photographs. He manipulates the symbols of multiple genres, making historical figures into superheroes and pop icons like Captain Native America and Custer versus Sitting Bull, but also destabilizes the seeming naturalness of romantic documentary images with the addition of unexpected elements like flying saucers or Godzilla. In other places, he negotiates the aesthetic of early 20th century photographs, picturing popular toys or other objects in place of human figures or landscapes. Judd is an accomplished animator, filmmaker, and stop-action artist. Though he avoids the fine art market, he also makes public murals, small prints and stickers, and partners with the native-owned clothing company working to make a dent in, quote, the knockoff indigenous art you find at big box stores. Judd's work is irreverent and funny, juxtaposing unexpected visuals and subjects, making works that are both amusing popular culture mashups and pointed commentary on the commodification of indigenous identities. Like Atlantan, he takes Princess Leia as motif. In My Great-Grandmother is a Hopi Indian Princess, Judd combines a 1922 Curtis photogravure, captioned Polini and Kuyame, from volume 12 of the North American Indian publication, with a Star Wars film still of Princess Leia pointing a blaster. The two young women stand behind Leia, leaning over her shoulder, seemingly staring at whatever Leia holds back. More than juxtaposing the two images, Judd inserts the women in the story, making it appear visually as if they are characters within the scene being played out. Though the title, he also asserts a family tie and plays with the fictional lineage of Leia herself. On the right, in the print Lego My Land headdress version, Judd pictures a Lego man toy with painted face, war bonnet, and scowl. The print takes the aesthetic of 19th and early 20th century photography with sepia toning and the blurred edges of pictorialist photographic practices. The title plays with the name of the Lego brand, but also with the ubiquitous Eggo commercials of a certain age's childhood, bringing to mind the catchphrase, Lego my Eggo. Here, Judd nods, albeit with a wink, to the very basis for the wars between the US settlers and tribal nations and the genocidal actions taken by the government, the usurpation of lands and resources. The Lego Man speaks to the continued visual typecasting and commodification of native identities distilled into a singular image, often signified through the sign of the war bonnet. You can, in fact, find large numbers of quote-unquote Indian Lego figures and sets on eBay and Amazon today. Moreover, the practice of playing Indian has a deep history in the region that is now the US, dating back to pre-Revolutionary War era. Philip J. Deloria details the history of dressing up and play acting indigeneity and the shifting ideologies behind it in his 1998 book, Playing Indian, moving through time from the Boston Tea Partiers who dressed as Mohawks to costumes worn by clubs during May Day celebrations to secret 19th century fraternal societies with elaborate ritual initiations to today's lingerie and festival wear. Judd's appropriation of a toy may itself be read as significant. The toy as inanimate object is symbolic of life suspended. It requires activation by the body, and once animate represents what Susan Stewart calls, quote, the world of the daydream, an entirely new temporal world parallel to, and hence never intersecting with, the world of everyday reality, end quote. The toy is, quote, the physical embodiment of the fiction. It is a device for fantasy, a point of beginning for narrative. The toy opens up an interior world, lending itself to fantasy and privacy, end quote. Moreover, Judd's works on the whole toy with the disconnection between the massive commercialization of culturally significant signs and severe lack of representation in the industries producing film and other consumer objects. His montages suggest of space outside of the everyday temporal world for playing with the fabrication of otherness produced by the West's imagination, turning it back on itself and inventing new fantasy histories. His attention to comic book characters is also significant beyond their iconicity. Superheroes in the many comic universes often fought Nazis in the World War II era, Captain America and Superman being two high-profile characters. Captain America was even drawn punching Hitler a year prior to the US involvement in World War II. However, as time went on, these storylines tended to lean towards a nationalistic propaganda rather than an ideological fight against white supremacy. Judd interrupts the intense whiteness of the superhero and cartoon cosmos and pushes, at least visually, towards a different kind of narrative in which the superheroes come from other lineages and will fight a different kind of fight. Inserting characters whose identities are rooted in indigeneity into the realm of fantasy heroes offers new chances for identified and alternative ways. Judd engages in a semiotic play, altering how meaning operates through these pop culture icons, sometimes divorcing signifiers from the bodies they've been attached to, and sometimes radically decontextualizing spaces, and layering new meanings through changes of context. Photographer Will Wilson takes up the legacy of documentary photography in a different manner, focusing on his subjects, the problematics of representation, and the photographic medium. In his series, The Critical Indigenous Photographic Exchange, Wilson creates striking black and white tintype portraits of individuals spanning multiple indigenous nations. The images are dramatic, with deeply saturated dark areas. Speaking of the period in which the North American Indian series covers, Wilson has written that he is, quote, impatient with the way that American culture remains enamored of one particular moment in a photographic exchange between Euro-American and Aboriginal American societies, end quote. The project seeks to intervene in the petrified imaging of Native American peoples through photographing Indigenous artists, professionals, government leaders, and others. Wilson employs the wet plate collodion photographic process used by Curtis and other photographers in early 1900s. The wet plate process was popular at the turn of the century, particularly for studio portraiture, due to the quick exposure time, relative inexpense, and ability to produce multiples. The process also allows for a high level of clarity and detail. Wilson, rather than printing his photographs on paper, chose the tintype as their final form. Unlike Curtis's images, which were printed and published in expensive volumes initially and as exhibition quality prints later, the tintype was a more democratic object. They are also a wet place process, but applied to a metal sheet and were popular with the general public as they were cheap and easy to produce. Wilson often describes this series as a means of time traveling. The representational and photographic void that is settled between Curtis's time and the present is in part a problem with the lack of visibility of Indigenous photographers and historical bias, though this is slowly changing with projects like the Horace Pula photograph project, and in part a continued representational fetishizing of Native peoples as a romantic trope. The representational problem of being locked into a bygone era extends into contemporary art writing. Writers today will often still describe the westernized aesthetic associated with ethnographic photography as depicting non-white subjects as savages or barbarians. While the visual cues used are certainly part of a systematic creation and politicizing of difference, which has been central to a dehumanizing project, I'm cautious of terms like savage when used without any historical context. A line from an essay in Hyperallergic provides an example. Quote, he, meaning Curtis, posed them as savages, naked, with bows drawn back, or as shamans in ceremonial garb, summoning spirits from the sky, end quote. Though the text is meant to be a critique, it negligently posits nudity, tools, and ceremony as necessarily savage, as uncivilized. There's a continuation of the collapse between cultural differences and the idea of savagery, which formed the ideological basis for genocidal attacks. The scholarly intervention into this equation has been fixated on a program of reestablishing the humanity of violently oppressed peoples. Yet artists and scholars alike have begun to question the utility of rehumanizing as a cure-all. Scholars like Zakiah and Mon Jackson argue against attempts at reassembling a, quote, human recognition within liberal humanism as an antidote to racialization, end quote. An artist and scholar, Londi Zondi, expands Jackson's arguments, saying colonialist ideology functions to invent the human within certain parameters, and to try to recuperate humanity means working within the parameters of that very colonialist thought, agreeing with Jackson about the need to think beyond the limits of liberal humanism. Wilson's critical and Indigenous photographic exchange is not a project of rehumanization. Rather, it is one of relationality, of closing gaps through the attestation of a continuum. The photographic project seeks to reopen the discursive disconnection among the contemporary sitters with those from the early 20th century photographs. Wilson asserts connections through familial, regional, and tribal ties, affirming again and again with each new portrait the presence and presentness of each of these individuals. Wilson's intervention into temporality extends to the aesthetics of the photographs. Wilson often uses intense lighting, and the processing and printing creates a kind of visual disturbance in the images. Unlike ethnographic photographs that strove for direct and categorizable detail, the visual disturbances in these tintypes vacillates between a ghostly appearance and giving the impression of the sitters being just on the other side of a dirty pane of glass. The interference gives the works a feeling of age, as if they've been well worn over time, even handled or lovingly touched. And the feeling of the sitters being barely separated from the viewer reiterates their closeness, infusing the images with a sense of physicality. Wilson describes the studio portrait as a ritual. The sitters are asked to bring objects that are meaningful to them and to participate in producing the photographs through a performative collaboration with the artist. Moreover, the resulting portraits are an act of exchange. The sitters are gifted the tintype and Wilson is courted the right to use the images in artworks. I read this exchange as support for the criticism launched by many Indigenous communities against contemporary anthropology's predilection for conducting studies of a community without sharing the research. The portraits I show here are images of other artists that sat for Wilson. Zig Jackson's portrait on the far right shows his penchant for humor in his photographic practice. Jackson holds a camera directed at Wilson while he stares back at him. Jackson is in fact known for turning his camera on other photographers, though usually not other artists. One of Jackson's series, humorously yet accurately titled Indian Photographing Tourist Photographing Indian, points his lens at white tourists who swarm native persons, often while wearing ceremonial clothing, at various events to take pictures. The tourists seem intent on playing ethnographer, playing out a well-worn scenario while taking care to angle their cameras. They line up and in some cases seriously invade the personal space of the people they want to photograph. Jackson turns their pseudo-ethnographic gaze back on them. He watches their actions, documenting their behavior as they seemingly unwittingly play out the colonial gaze in real time. For the last work in my discussion, I want to return to Wendy Redstar. Redstar's series 1880 Crow Peace Delegations include reprints of photographs Redstar came across during research at the Smithsonian Institute. Portraits of the 6 Crow chiefs, including Medicine Crow shown here, were taken by Charles Milton Bell in the course of their visit to DC. They had traveled to the US Capitol to negotiate land rights and the boundaries of the reservation after encroaching settlers found gold deposits in the area south of the Yellowstone River and the rail industry pushed for access to build. Bell routinely photographed Native delegations for the Department of the Interior and Bureau of Ethnology. Like Curtis, Bell's portraits were part of a program of salvage ethnography, though one sponsored directly by the government, documenting Indigenous peoples. The archive of delegation images were employed commercially by the US government, which made them into commodities, printed as cabinet cards, advertisements, illustrations, and as fine art prints. Their diffuse circulation and the government origins intensified the evacuation of meaning and historical information. Medicine Crow's face, for example, has been used to sell cigarettes and even bottled tea in recent years. Knowledge about who these men were and the circumstances of their portraiture were largely unknown or told exclusively from government perspectives. Responding to the impoverished history and one-sided nature of the narratives these objects supposedly told, Redstar sought to remake the images, incorporating absolute authorities and knowledge. Writing an essay with scholar Shannon Vittoria about the original images, they described the way that the Crow chiefs, quote, actively fashioned themselves as independent leaders of sovereign nation, foregrounding the agency of Native sitters in portraits made by non-Native artists, end quote. In fact, she found photographs of the delegation taken in Bozeman, Montana in the studio of Henry Bird Calfee just before the group left for DC. The delegation is careful of their appearance in both sets of photographs, and while they follow certain conventions and positioning common to studio portraiture at large, their dust and other accoutrements are indicative of personal choices. Further, the men wear the same clothing and style of hair in both sets of photographs, with Redstar noting this detail demonstrates the men's preferences in terms of self-presentation and their interest in using the photographic medium for their own ends. The series by Redstar begins with the archival images and outlines the figures and elements of their clothing, hair, and other accoutrements in lines of thin red ink. She then provides information about the features she's traced in script. She notes details specific to Medicine Crow, such as the inclusion of ermine on his shirt and leggings, but also extrapolates, explaining that their inclusion means that he captured a gun and is a successful war leader. Elsewhere, she writes that his hair bow is broken and that he wears hair extensions. She also includes information about his life, saying that he was appointed as a tribal judge in 1890 and had 6 wives, as well as historical information like the hair bow he wears was out of fashion at the time of the photograph. An especially important aspect of her methodology is the inclusion of absolute words and names. The survival of language is critical to the continuum of cultural identities and was systematically attacked in the boarding school era and beyond. The action of tracing is one of careful attention, emotion, and embodies a meditative quality. Talking with the artist, she noted how the movement allowed her to find items and details that were not immediately apparent. The exercise became a method of uncovering what was at times hidden, even if in plain sight. Redstar's appropriation of ethnographic images operates as a means to reinterpret them in a way that is its own mode of history writing. Like the act of cutting in her previously discussed work, Red Star's performative interventions reactivate the photographs, asserting not only that the subjects pictured are agentive in their self-presentation, but also brings her own presence to the images. Canonical photographic theory often posits the photograph as a kind of death, something not only removed from the passage of linear time, but a form that disembodies what is pictured. Taken in conjunction with the precepts of ethnographic photography, the subject picture then becomes inexpicably absent, simultaneously always already dead while endlessly silently available for consumption. Red Star's reintroduction of movement through cutting and tracing becomes a radical means of re-embodying both the subject and the object. The artist recuperates her own history through the images of members of her own nation, but is also writing and enriching American history more broadly. Each of the artists addressed here are in their own ways writing histories, cultivating meaning for perspectives originating in communities historically denied the means to enunciate it. Critically, they do so through the very mediums, namely photography, that were employed in the service of withholding it. The resulting works redefine what the original images are capable of signifying in both broad and specific ways for both native and non-native viewers. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessica, for that insightful essay. I will now invite Victoria to rejoin us on the screen as we open up the Q&A session for this these two papers. And just as a reminder, you can go ahead and type your questions into the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. And while we wait for people to type their questions, I do have a question for Victoria. That in your discussion, you talked about some of Belle's paintings that she kind of talks about her own identity or looks at her own identity. Do you feel like in some of Wolf's writing, she looks at herself as well, or is she mostly focused on her sister and kind of redepicting or reiterating her sister's identity?
Yeah, thank you, Tara, for the question. And I think that's really rich because I think that what I was trying to sort of bring up is the dialogue between the two that allows for both of their individual expressions and their expressions of one another to kind of come to the fore. But to be pointed with your question, I do think that that Wolf does treat writing as a point of self-expression, and we can really understand that when we look at her letters and her diaries. And one of the reasons that I think we can really look at Clarissa, and that's why I brought in Mrs. Dalloway in particular, is because Wolf really mimics Clarissa in a lot of her diaries and her letters. And she talks a lot about her marriage being somewhat unfulfilling. She and Leonard had a very deep connection with one another, but she always felt that marriage as a construct was something that she didn't identify with, and that we can really see come through with Clarissa Dalloway and in Mrs. Ramsey, who I brought up as well in the presentation. And I think that Belle similarly reckons with that role of marriage, and she had a very kind of unconventional marriage herself. She and Clive were married, and then their marriage kind of fell apart, but they decided to stay married, although each of them took different lovers and lived independently and then lived back together again. So that's a long-winded way of saying that, yes, I think both of them kind of use their own mediums to individually kind of explore their own identities as well as each other's.
That's awesome. Thank you. And Jessica, I also had a question for you about that final image that you showed from Red Star about some of the ways that she was bringing out more of an appropriate or more defined identity for the subjects that she's looking at. Are some of those things that she brought up, would those have been items that the photographer would have added, like props, like she mentioned hair extensions and stuff, or is that part of tribal culture that has just not been talked about?
Everything that the men were wearing were part of tribal culture. They were chosen by the men wearing them, and she cites the fact that they're present in both sets of images from prior to getting to DC in the delegation, and histories from sources that she has on the Upsloke tribe.
Thank you. Vanessa, Victoria, sorry, this question is for you. Thank you for your excellent paper. Vanessa Bell's work is not discussed much. I was wondering about the third portrait Bell painted of Wolf. In addition to the face being limited to just blue spots, I did notice distinctive brown lines below her chin. While they could be read as shadow, I was wondering if it was to indicate a beard and therefore suggesting a dual sexual identification.
Sure, thank you for that question. And you're right, Vanessa Bell's work is not discussed very much, to great dismay, because she is incredible and her works are so rich and exciting. I implore everyone to go read more about her. She's incredible. That's a really interesting observation, and I personally haven't interpreted it as such, but I think that something that is really kind of opened up in that expression of identity is that sort of multiple reading and the multivalent kind of layers of identity and sexuality that come through. So I wouldn't say that that's definitely not there. And I think that considering the androgyny that both Woolf and Bell explore, it's not out of the question. It's a really cool observation. Thanks for sharing and asking the question.
Wonderful. And this other question is for Victoria as well. Has Vanessa Bell's role as an interior designer been explored in the field of art history? I'm taken by the vibrance and eclecticism of her painted interiors.
Yeah, that's also a great question. And it's actually something that I'm looking into now with my current research, is exploring the way that art decoration can kind of blur this line between what art is and what fine art is. And the Omega workshops that Bell was very much a part of were very interested in sort of breathing art and breathing life into interior decoration. And similarly, the Charleston Trust, which is currently a museum in Sussex, which was Bell's home, which I brought up in the presentation as well, is a museum just dedicated to all of her interior design. And she's painted everything from the walls with Duncan Grant in particular, who lived there in that home with her when she first arrived. And I do think that that sort of exploration of what is kind of fine art kind of comes into this question here when we look at her interior decoration. And I think that specifically in Bell's work and in Bloomsbury's work, I think that most of their interior decoration not only is art, but was intended to be art. And we really see that when we look at the Omega workshops and this insistence that even kind of everyday objects have a vitality to them and they have an art and a presence to them. So yeah, thank you for your question.
We'll give it just a few more minutes here to see if other questions come in, and then if not, we will close the question. So thank you so much for your great paper. This one is for Jessica. My own research deals with responses to colonial ethnographic imagery in the contemporary South Asian context. And I'm curious to know more about your thoughts on the limitations of photography to respond to imperialist histories. More pointedly, are there challenges to using the oppressor's tools and crafting a response to those legacies?
Thank you for this question. I'm also very interested in that problem. And I'll answer by talking a little bit about how some of the artists that I work on, I think, are dealing with that problem. And I think it's largely through the infusion of performance into their works. There's a number of artists, the collective La Pocha Nostra, other works by Wendy Red Star, James Luna, and a number of other people who incorporate performance in a way that makes the object no longer, I think, just a photograph or just a documented performance, but really melds the two in a way that I think is meant to intervene in the history of the subject-object relationships that are associated with photographic theory. And I'm still working my way through it. It's actually a large part of my dissertation, and I'm deeply interested in that question.
All right, Jessica, this one is for you as well. Thank you for your rich paper. I too have been taken by the many Native artists revisiting Curtis's photography. I was particularly impressed by the artist whose name I forget, who inscribed information on the photos, correcting and expanding the specific subject's history. I was wondering if this artist did an expanded series or just this one.
Yes, so that was Wendy Red Star, and the 1880 Peace Corps delegation is a series of 6 images, and she uses the 6 photographs from the delegation taken in DC. But she also has a series from 1873 where there was another delegation prior to the 1880 delegation, and I believe that one also has 6, but maybe a few more. It also includes the images of wives that traveled with the men. And the 2 series are really just beautiful, and I'm really interested in the way that she uses photography to write new histories.
The questioner just said thank you, Jessica. And if there aren't any other questions for our speakers right now, I will go ahead and close the first session, and we will reconvene at 2:15 for the next session. Before, there was a question in the chat, I think, Jessica, for the name of the artist that you just mentioned.
Wendy Red Star.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, thank you.
I can spell out the name too, actually, if that will help.
Thank you. Thank you both so much for your papers. These were such interesting talks about these different subjects and about the overarching theme of the symposium, which is identity. And we're looking forward to our next session at 2:15. Thank you so much.
Hello and welcome back to the 2021 Emerging Scholars Symposium. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Francesca, and I am the treasurer of the Association of Graduate Art Students here at the University of Georgia and Lamar Dodd School of Art. I'm pleased to introduce the next 2 speakers whose research looks at the larger symposium theme of identity, paying particular attention to American art in relation to colonialization. Our first presentation is titled American Colonialization Society, Identity and Agency, presented by Annie Poslusny, a master's student studying American art history at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And our second speaker today is Julia Hammer-Light, a PhD student in art history at the University of Delaware. Her presentation is titled A Watchful Archive, Self-Fashioning in the Photographs of the WPA Slave Narratives Collection. At this time, I'd like to let the first presentation begin, starting with Annie.
Thank you so much, Francesca, and thank you to the organizers. And thank you to Charlotte and Callan. And all right. This paper focuses on the daguerreotypes of African Americans who emigrated to Liberia under the auspices of the American Colonization Society, or the ACS, an organization that proposed the removal of free Blacks from American society as a solution to the problem of slavery. Through an analysis of the daguerreotypes of Jane Roberts, Joseph Jenkins Roberts, and Edward J. Roy, taken by African-American photographer Augustus Washington, I will show how the sitters negotiated multiple discourses of identity, race, and colonialism. These daguerreotypes do not simply display the social status of the sitters in Liberia, but also situates them in an implicit social order which spans the Atlantic. As a colonizer coming from the position of the colonized, African American settlers sitting for photographs in Liberia had the opportunity to assert themselves as subjects. I argue that these images were a type of visual argument on behalf of African Americans in the struggle for identity, equality, and recognition in the United States. The membership of the American Colonization Society included missionaries, politicians, Northerners, Southerners, and slave owners, all white and mostly men. Slave owners typically supported the ACS because they considered freed Blacks as extremely dangerous individuals who incited slaves to resist and or run away. Abolitionists were divided on the issue of the ACS. Some agreed that Blacks would never be treated as equals in the United States, but many considered the ACS as a means of perpetuating slavery by removing freed Blacks from society. African Americans were skeptical and wary of the ACS's motive. While some African Americans considered the appeal of potential freedom from racism, many freed Blacks in northern states spoke openly against the ACS. Having been born in the United States, they felt no connection to Africa whatsoever and considered the U.S. home. Many African Americans doubted that the colony in Liberia even existed. They believed it was conceived as a means of exterminating freed Blacks, and that they would never leave the shores of the United States alive. In 1822, the society established on the west coast of Africa a colony that in 1847 became the independent nation of Liberia. By 1867, the society had sent more than 13,000 emigrants. The individuals pictured in these photos were impacted by 19th century discourse surrounding the role of photography in society. The daguerreotype, the first photographic process, was invented by Louis-Jacques Mandé Daguerre and spread rapidly around the world after its presentation to the public in Paris in 1839. Exposed in a camera obscura and developed in mercury vapors, each highly polished silvered copper plate is a unique photograph that, when viewed in proper light, exhibits extraordinary detail and three-dimensionality. The daguerreotype soon became extremely popular in the United States, where in the 1840s and 1850s, thousands of daguerreotypists vied for clients from the East Coast to the West. The new medium's success in the United States was built upon the patronage of the average citizen who desired a simple likeness to keep or perhaps to send to a loved one. For 19th century Americans, a daguerreotype portrait was a way of combining the scientific, true aspect of photography, which reproduces authentic likenesses, as well as a way of capturing the subject's personality. Alan Trachtenberg states that 19th century Americans believed that a portrait could express the essence of the subject, the sitter's true moral character, and this was largely based on popular beliefs of physiognomy and phrenology. Daguerreotypes offered a unique fusion of authenticity and character. Having one's picture taken was a common experience for 19th century middle-class Americans. This process included wearing one's best clothes, while studios were decorated to resemble upper middle-class homes. Sean Michelle Smith notes that African Americans used this new technology of representation to perform identities and to shape a dynamic visual culture. For many African Americans, photography served not only as a means of self-representation, but also as a political tool with which to claim a place in public and private spheres circumscribed by race. Smith states that the photograph became a key site through which a new identity could be produced and promulgated. For Jane and Joseph Roberts and Edward J. Roy, photography provided an opportunity for self-representation and the Liberian colony an opportunity for freedom. Frederick Douglass spoke eloquently of photography as a catalyst for social change. He stressed that it was only by making ourselves and others objects of observation and contemplation that we can begin to imagine better selves and better futures. The intriguing suggestion that African Americans objectified themselves when they were routinely perceived in antebellum America as a commodity seems odd. However, Douglass is urging personal objectification as a means for objective critique. In other words, pictures enable us to see ourselves from the outside, to contemplate and address how to improve ourselves. If the mental image we have of ourselves does not match with the outer image represented by the photograph, this presents the opportunity for self-critique. According to Douglass, self-critique is the foundation of progress, and this progress will become a catalyst for social change. How you self-represent is not only important to you personally, but can also influence the society in which you live. Therefore, having your picture taken in the 19th century had high stakes. Not only was it believed to show an authentic likeness of the person, but that it also revealed their true moral character. In addition, for African Americans, the stakes were even higher. For many groups in 19th century America, in particular people of African descent, there was a tremendous chasm between how they wanted to be presented and society's portrayal of them. Whites often perceived the facial features of African Americans as interchangeable and undistinguished, and that by involving such racist assumptions, white artists actively created and perpetuated a visual tradition of negative or thoughtlessly stereotyped representations of Blacks. The negative ways that African physiognomy was presented in art, and more significantly in portraiture, was a barrier to the reception and advancement of African Americans in American society through the end of the 19th century. Typological photographs, particularly those that became popular in the 1860s and 1870s, were soon to be self-evident, to speak for themselves. Typological systems depended on the widespread contemporary interest in the body, especially the head. Silhouettes, portrait daguerreotypes, and phrenology all directed special attention to the shape, size, or character of the head as a record of individuality. The polygenicists, by contrast, were interested in defining separate racial types. Their charts, derived from phrenological models, often showed crude rankings, as you can see here, from the primate head to the African to the classical Greek. This thinly disguised racism was also reflected in their research, which involved not only the physical measurement of the body, but an assessment of the moral character, manner, and social habits of each racial type. Frederick Douglass argued that due to the ingrained tradition of dehumanizing Black bodies in representation, a change would only occur when artists and writers of African descent began to be concerned with their own and others' depictions. Douglass recognized that the inequity of interracial power relations in the United States meant that the opportunity to create or commission an accurate and sympathetic likeness of the self, to give form to a specific and empowered identity, was a type of treatment that was unavailable to Black sitters during the antebellum and Reconstruction periods, unless they themselves had commissioned the portrait from an artist who was sensitive to their needs and desires. The African Americans who left the United States to emigrate to Liberia and create a new nation carried these concepts about photography with them across the Atlantic. The opportunity to craft an identity in which they could display their true selves and shape their identities was particularly alluring. With all these ideas in mind, Jane Roberts, seen here, took her seat before Augustus Washington's camera, dressed in clothes characteristic of women's fashionable attire in the 1850s. Her lace-gloved hands rest on her lap, and her gently curled fingers cradle a fan, a sign of her femininity and refinement. Roberts wears a front-fastening jacket bodice with a V-neck, long sleeves with ruffle embellishments, and an underlying chemisette and full skirt. She faces her right, posing in three-quarters view. Her back is slightly hunched, and her languid eyes are directed toward the viewer. Her hair is parted and smoothed to symmetrically frame her face. Like many Americans, the First Lady of Liberia marshaled pose, dress, and countenance to convey identity and construct this image according to bourgeois criteria. Clothes were a particularly loaded way of signaling one's place in Liberian society. African American arrivals in Liberia were initially shocked by the indigenous population, whom they saw as scandalously underclothed. Their attire, for the most part, consisted of nothing on young children, a small apron-type garment around the waists of unmarried women, a wrap skirt called a wapa for submarried women, a toga-type garment for mandingo women, and a short garment wrapped around the loins for men. For their part, the indigenous Africans were not impressed by the newly arrived African Americans either. They perceived the settlers as white because for them, whiteness was not about skin color, but customs such as clothing, writing, and religion. African American settlers were eager to maintain the distinctive trappings of civilization, and they wrote back to the United States with a request for clothing. Defined through material attributes, civilization was something one could attain or use. Clothing was of such importance to the African Americans that some even wrote to their former owners. To acquire clothing made in the United States, James Gibbon Smith drew on his relationship with ACS recording secretary James W. Luganville on at least 2 occasions. Luganville had trained Smith and Dr. Roberts in medicine during his tenure as colonial physician in Liberia in the 1840s. Smith wrote, "Please send me a superior hat and a good leather hat box. You know that my head is somewhat smaller than yours, a mite smaller." Smith also requested that Mrs. Luganville may send a yard like it for Mrs. Smith, since there is none like we know of in Liberia, referring to a swatch of blue silk fabric. These settler requests for clothing demonstrate that the portraits were produced in part through transatlantic exchanges. Just like the African Americans, these textiles retrace the route in which slaves were brought to the United States. American fashion functions within the photograph to insert the sitter into American consumer culture through the displays of European and American commodities imported to Africa. Robert's selection of an American dress rather than an African one is, according to Homi Bhabha, a means of accessing power through mimicry. By selecting an American dress, Jane Roberts enters into a visual conversation with American society, establishing herself as an equal to other First Ladies. African Americans in 19th century United States would have been acutely aware of how they were perceived by white Americans. W.E.B. Du Bois coins the term double consciousness to describe this psychological conflict. Du Bois states, "It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder." In order for Jane Roberts to enter into conversation with the American middle class, she needed to present herself in a way that whites would instantly recognize. The fashionable American dress enabled her to do so. Roberts' daguerreotype does not simply display her social status in Liberia, but it also situates her in an implicit social order which spans the Atlantic. As a colonizer coming from the position of the colonized, African American settlers sitting for photographs in Liberia had the opportunity to assert themselves as subjects. Through her portrait, Roberts clarifies for herself and the audience the difference between being African and African American. Unlike Agassiz's hypothesis, this difference was defined not by biology, but by the performances of display and culture. Jane Roberts' fancy dress not only identifies her as civilized, in contrast to what was perceived as the indigenous African's lack of dress, but also aligns her with the American middle class. Roberts' display taps into the hierarchical class structure of American society, while simultaneously applying these standards to the Liberian colony. Joseph Roberts, seen here, is in a fancy cravat and silken vest, which serve to identify him as a member of the American middle class as well. And the elegance of this portrait is striking. In examining the daguerreotype of Joseph Jenkins Roberts, we note that it is a political portrait, one in which Roberts is attempting to establish himself as the first Black president of the Liberian colony. This portrait was created to display dignity, power, and equality. Roberts would have been aware of the presidential portraits of the United States and made the decision to emulate elements of these portraits. In addition, Roberts' portrait bears a striking resemblance to that of the 1847 portrait of Frederick Douglass. The luxurious fabrics, from the silken vest and tie to the sheen of the jacket, are similar in both portraits. Even Roberts' hairstyle is modeled after that of Douglass. They both share a directness of gaze towards the viewer, although Roberts does not match the intensity of Douglass. By mimicking the appearance of Douglass, Roberts accesses his power. Douglass was the most photographed person of the 19th century, and his thoughts on the new photographic technology and its implications to society were profound. He asserted, quote, "We reformers can criticize the characters and actions of men about us because we can see them outside of ourselves, just as we can when viewing a photograph of ourselves and compare them one with the other. But self-criticism, out of which comes the highest attainments of human excellence, arises out of the power we possess of making ourselves objective to ourselves. we can see our interior selves as distinct personalities as though looking in a glass, unquote. Henry Louis Gates notes that for Douglas, Daguerre's genius is that he rendered in 2 dimensions, in tangible form, this wondrous process of visualizing ourselves doing an action and reflecting upon it as we do it, rendering the subjective objective, giving it form. Douglas encouraged African Americans to use photography as a means to counter the racist, stereotypical images of Blacks which proliferated in the 19th century. He urged African Americans to embrace photography and use it to negate and supplant the images of, quote, the debased, subhuman Negro, fabricated and so profusely distributed by the slave power, wherein illusions that take the form of solid reality and shadows get themselves recognized as substance, unquote. Roberts marshals the characteristics of dignity, humanity, and leadership in his portrait, accessing these qualities by modeling his portrait after that of Frederick Douglass. Edward J. Roy was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Liberia, as well as its 5th president. In this image, Roy is standing with his hand raised as if swearing an oath. It is a pose conveying honesty and the significance of such a vow. It is a striking image by itself. However, when contrasted with that of abolitionist John Brown, it becomes even more so. Both of these daguerreotypes were taken by Augustus Washington. In this image, John Brown holds a subterranean passway flag and appears to be pledging allegiance to the cause of freedom for all. The subterranean passway was a plan of Brown's created as a militant alternative to the Underground Railroad. The scheme involved a network of armed men from the Allegheny Mountains to the Adirondacks for the purpose of raiding slave plantations and running fugitive slaves to Canada. The juxtaposition of these images shows John Brown pledging allegiance to the idea of racial equality in America, while Edward J. Roy pledges allegiance to a separatist ideal of a Black Liberia. The portraits of Jane and Joseph Roberts and Edward J. Roy portray characteristics of dignity, self-possession, and individuality. The daguerreotypes carried these implicit messages to the United States. However, once they reached the United States, they were now considered to be not just images of prominent Liberians, they became a commodity from Africa. Similar to African curiosities and African American handicrafts, the ACS wanted to acquire photographs of the Liberian colony and the colonists to legitimize and encourage the continuance of the colonial venture. Washington's photos of President Roberts and his wife Jane were entrusted to Reverend John McKay, an African American minister visiting Liberia from Indiana. As soon as McKay returned to the United States, the news about the photographs came to the attention of the New York Colonization Society. The society was informed that they could not have the photographs as they were on their way to a gentleman, so the society made plans to copy the images. The society then hired photographer Rufus Sampson to re-photograph Washington's original daguerreotypes, and these images would be published in the New York Colonization Society's print materials as proof that African Americans were healthy and thriving in Liberia. Washington's original daguerreotypes traveled to Philadelphia and were again copied. In 1854, the Pennsylvania Colonization Society notified their constituency of the portraits in their city by printing the images in their own Colonization Herald. the New York Colonization Society published wood engravings of Roberts in their own newspaper, which were based on Washington's original daguerreotypes. Printed portraits of Roberts were reproduced widely in colonization literature, including the Colonization Herald and the New York Colonization Society's annual report of 1856. What ACS members and their supporters thought about the daguerreotypes or the wood engraving translations is not clear. Beyond accolades of Washington's fine daguerreotypes, there are no known records indicating how colonizationists felt about these portraits. White reception must be deduced from colonizationist writings about interacting with actual Liberians. One visitor felt, quote, that they behaved like well-bred white people, unquote, and that while he was with them, he forgot all about the prejudices of color. Yet, not all white Americans were as receptive. Another white traveler observed, quote, the people generally dress above their knees, extravagantly so, and the quantity of kid gloves and umbrellas displayed on all occasions does not promise well for a nation whose hope rests on hard work and well-developed muscles, unquote. Marie Tyler McGraw notes these comments echo sentiments expressed in antebellum American newspapers deriding fancy dress worn by African Americans. Ironically, if Washington's photographs were successful in portraying their subjects as genteel, civilized people, then they were just as likely to produce resistance as acceptance by white audiences in the United States, precisely because they disrupted American expectations of Black dress and comportment. Frederick Douglass recognized that he had to meet white expectations of authentic Blackness in the presentation of his person in order to effectively convey his message. Touring England, he wrote, quote, I am hardly Black enough for the British taste, but by keeping my hair as woolly as possible, I make out to pass for at least half a Negro, end quote. Jane and Joseph Roberts and Edward J. Roy crafted their portraits using American clothes and conventional American poses. They did so by synthesizing 19th century discourse on photography and racial equality, producing portraits which displayed their individuality and humanity. Through their appearance and countenance, they tapped into the power of the new technology of photography to construct self-representation. Thank you.
Thank you, Annie. At this time, I ask that attendees save questions till the end of the session, and I'd like to now welcome our second speaker for this session, Julia Hammer-Light, to begin her presentation.
Hi, thank you for that introduction, Francesca. Let me share my screen. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. First, I want to say thank you to Francesca and the rest of the AGAS organization, Charlotte, Tara, and Noah, as well as Callan for text support for organizing the symposium. I wanted to thank the audience and other speakers for sharing your time with me and the other speakers this afternoon, and to the Lamar Dodd School of Art and the Georgia Museum of Art for hosting this event. This paper grew out of my recent MA project on the photographs of the WPA slave narratives held at the Library of Congress. My plans to visit the collection in April of 2020 were disrupted by the arrival of COVID-19 and its accompanying closures, and the Library of Congress has not permitted outside scholars to visit since the pandemic began. I want to provide this disclaimer because, as a result, the process and priorities of digitization have inevitably shaped my project in ways that I cannot now fully account for. Studying an archive of subaltern experience from afar through the lens of only widely available sources can reinforce the same social and political patterns of visibility and invisibility. Everyone's feedback at this juncture as a result feels particularly important, and I look forward to any comments and questions, especially since my talk and Annie's talk stand to have a lot in common, I think. And then a final note before we begin. The manner in which the texts of these interviews, which have been widely used in scholarship, were collected emphasizes racial difference, and sometimes in the way that they are transcribed, become violently or disturbingly racialized and racist. I've therefore quoted from the interviews in only 2 locations where it is important to my argument, and will provide content warnings before presenting those quotes. The image is slightly out of focus, not blurred or softened, but lacking clarity, as though veiled. William Colbert stands between 2 houses before a fence that hides an alley. A flat white sky, boxed in by 3 roof lines, closes off the portrait's depth. My eyes come up short at the brick wall denied entry. I can go no further into the plain, and so I stay with Colbert. I turn neither left nor right. His eyes almost disappear in the shadow of his hat brim, and in the shade I see that he looks out to the side, avoiding the camera, avoiding the photographer. As a man who lived through Emancipation, Reconstruction, and now the Great Depression, he's seen eras. He likely knows the power of an image from a photographic lens. Or perhaps a neighbor is walking past behind the photographer, staring curiously, wondering what is going on. This gelatin silver print and its accompanying interview are part of a collection of approximately 500 photographs cataloged in the Library of Congress, alongside the text of 2,300 interviews that comprise the collection now called Born in Slavery, Slave Narratives from the Federal Writers Project. For 2 years, between 1936 and 1938, writers hired in 17 states by the Federal Writers Project, the FWP, a subset of the Works Progress Administration, the WPA, interviewed and photographed individuals who had been born enslaved. The FWP had been created in 1935 to provide employment for writers and other white-collar workers. The project's primary goal was to create a series of state guides. However, in 1936, without prompting from the federal offices, writers in Alabama, Arkansas, Florida, Georgia, South Carolina, Texas, and Virginia all began collecting personal histories from people born enslaved. These early efforts were largely led by Black writers who recognized that as the last generation to experience slavery died, the opportunity to record their words as history would as well. However, once the national editors received the first narratives from the writers, they formally established a federal initiative. The project was fraught to its foundations. In the official script, white folklorist John A. Lomax wrote for the interviewers in 1937, he instructs them to, quote, get the Negro interested in talking about the days of slavery, unquote. While Black writers had led the earlier initiatives and the teams in Louisiana and Virginia continued to be led by Black writers, the majority of writers who participated in the federal project were white. The questions the white writers asked and the manner in which they asked them subjected their informants to racist biases and prejudices, especially in the South at that time. The introduction to Lomax's questionnaire begins, quote, it should be remembered that the Federal Writers Project is not interested in taking sides on any question. The workers should not censor any material, regardless of its nature. The violence of slavery and its afterlives, however, cannot be approached from a neutral position. In its aspirations to do so, the questionnaire exposes how the very collection of the interviews and their later editing created an environment of anti-Blackness. The writers transcribed narratives from notes they took during conversations with formerly enslaved individuals. Then, state editors compiled the textual accounts and sent a selection of the interviews with accompanying photographs to the federal agency. After layers of transcription and editing, the interviews ultimately became carefully crafted third or fourth hand accounts of slavery. And in 1941, Benjamin A. Botkin, former folklore editor of the FWP and chief editor of the Writers Unit at the Library of Congress, led the effort to compile the edited narratives into volumes divided by states. The archivist titled the series Slave Narratives, a folk history of slavery in the United States from interviews with former slaves. The formation of the WPA Slave Narratives Project was extractive. Writers took the likeness and voice of formerly enslaved people without giving anything in return. As a repository of national history, the Library of Congress has kept the materials the writers collected. Return or exchange, the actions that construct the reciprocity, were not built into the institution's structure. But in this paper, I explore whether reciprocity is possible in the present and what return might look like. The past cannot be sealed from our study of it. Historian of photography Ariella Azoulay has argued that our scholarly archival studies should push beyond revisionist histories to advocate for reparations. For even within revisionist historical projects, she argues, scholars reproduce the categories of slave and free, past and present, perpetrator and victim, that structure the imperial production of history. Revision means stopping short of demanding the transformation of the institution. Archival reciprocity in the present can, I argue, make way for reparations through a return of narrative agency to the individuals pictured and a redistribution of the rights to the project's legacy. Identifying the narrative agency of the subjects of the photographs means reading them as independent objects. The texts of the narratives have been widely discussed from the perspective of either writing a history of the experience of enslavement or analyzing how archival structures replicate the subjugation of imperialism. The photographs, however, and the questions they present have never been considered on their own terms. In my presentation, I will examine a selection of photographs rather than the archived collection. In each print, I focus on how each subject constructed a sense of self through what they wore, how they stood, where they directed their gaze, and the artifacts they brought into the frame of the image with them. Building upon the work of scholars like Azoulay, Stephen Best, Tina Campt, Cheryl Finley, Christina Sharp, and Sean Michelle Smith, I ask, how can the Library of Congress and archives more generally redistribute the right to interpretation or ownership of the WPA Slave Narratives collection? The responsibility to define what these photographs mean should not belong to the archival institution, and the individuals in the photographs should not be objectified as mere examples in a collection. Archival reciprocity means questioning who should inherit the legacy of these images, how, and what forms of ownership are possible. The portrait of Colbert precedes the account of his interview in the manuscript of narratives from Alabama. The pages before and the pages after are typewritten on onion skin. Only this page is heavy enough to bear the weight of the print. Moving forward, I flip the page again. The name of the writer hired by the FWP is usually recorded at the top of each narrative. Quote, John Morgan Smith, editorial department, is typed at the top here, as well as on many other narratives in the volume. The photographs are unattributed, but correspondence indicates that writers either took the photographs themselves or sometimes worked in pairs, one interviewing and the other photographing or recording audio. A brown blotch in the upper right-hand corner, a coffee drip, a remnant of some long ago lunch, overlaps an editor's annotations. I have transcribed the words on the slide, and here I'm quoting from the text. Were the penciled words written before or after that drop sunk into the page? Those words haunt me. In this context, what constitutes a good ending? While digitization of the manuscripts from microfilm have made the text of the narratives widely available, annotations like these are invisible without the actual manuscript or a high-quality scan. The stain on the paper and the lead of the pencil remind me that this book is handmade, constructed, despite its appearance as a unified, reified thing. Most of the photographs taken for the WPA slave narratives are similarly small in scale. In the manuscripts, pages of text isolate the photographs from one another so that the words of the interview become the context for reading the photograph. Anthropologist Elizabeth Edwards describes how the form in which an image is displayed and used contributes to a cultural expectation about its function. The material photo object here, not just the image, scripts the viewer's construction of meaning. The volumes that contain these photo objects have encouraged viewers to see the images as illustrations, drawing on tropes of ethnographic photography, bound to text rather than documents in their own right. Ownership of history and the right to tell it publicly constitutes the stakes of the WPA Slave Narratives Project. The individuals interviewed were born enslaved in many different states, and after emancipation, each led a full life within freedom. Yet the narratives bind them together based on experiences they had as children and teenagers, and the photographs position them within a larger visual narrative of slavery. Even in the title of the collection, they remain slaves, not free men and women. In the photograph, William Colbert appears boxed in, but in shifting his eyes to the left, leaning on his cane in a certain way, placing his hand just so, tilting his hat to cast a shadow. In all of these gestures, he fashions a sense of self within the frame. This self-fashioning is crucial to the portraits. By looking for how Colbert exercised self-fashioning, viewers open their eyes to moments of resistance that break through the archive's boundaries. Narrative agency does not necessarily require the individual to be in control of how the photograph is taken. Tina Campt argues that the concept of agency should be uncoupled from the idea of self-fashioning, so that self-fashioning is described in terms of the individual's tense response to, quote, extremely limited opportunities for self-expression, unquote. Tense expressions of refusal in the set of someone's shoulders or the resting of hands are too particular for the easy categorization of documentary or ethnographic photography. By undermining these categories, these tense gestures communicate a sense of self. While the photograph attempts to place Colbert within a series as an object of preservation, his gestures express a liberatory restraint and refusal. In this portrait, Charles H. Anderson appears self-assured. He sits back in his chair, pipe in hand. His suit is neat and trim. Either the arrival of Ruth Thompson, the interviewer, did not surprise him, the waistcoat and tie signify, or he is ready at all times to present himself. A Grand Army of the Republic, the GAR, an organization for veterans of the Union Army, uniform badge is pinned to the crown of his hat, another badge pinned to his lapel, and a jeweled tie pin in the shape of a star winks out above his waistcoat. Although the text of the interviews spends only a paragraph on Anderson's time with the Union Army, over 70 years later, he proudly wears the proof of his service on his body. The text does not even mention that Anderson was part of the GAR, which was the largest association for Union veterans of the Civil War, both black and white, and first chartered in Decatur, Illinois. In 1866, it seems possible or even likely, in 1866. It seems possible or even likely that when he was interviewed, Anderson described his service to the Union Army and the GAR to Thompson, and that Thompson or her editor chose to exclude those parts of the conversation. They may have deemed these stories of liberation and freedom irrelevant to the experience of slavery. There have been other documented cases like that. By the 1930s, national memory had whitewashed the Civil War, removing from the historical narrative the participation of scores of Black soldiers. Yet Anderson displays that history on his body, in his props and poses, speaking visually what national commemoration had expunged. He resists the erasures of the text and takes no chances in communicating how he wants to be remembered. Extended third-person narration within the interview describes the inside of his home in greater detail than it does his military and community service. Thompson describes a sitting room decorated with rust-colored mohair armchairs and prim doilies, a standing clock, and 7 enlarged photographs hanging on the wall. Anderson might have introduced the topic, or else Thompson might have asked him about one of the pictures. And here I quote from Anderson's words, quote, "That was me at 37, had it taken for my boss where I worked. It was a postcard, and then I had it enlarged for myself. That was just before I married Helen." That portrait that he describes is not the one we see here, but an invisible portrait that he chose to enlarge for his home, that he saw every day, that he recognized as himself. His explanation of the interview raises questions that the interview does not answer. Where did he work at the time? Did his boss commission the portrait, or did Anderson have it taken as a gift? When and why did he have the image enlarged? What might it have meant to him? Portraiture was an important part of how Black Americans navigated freedom. And this here is where I think that my talk speaks to Annie's quite well. Photography evolved nearly simultaneously with the seismic demographic and geographic shifts that followed the Civil War. Activists like Sojourner Truth and Frederick Douglass deployed the power of photography to formulate a new definition of personhood based on objectification and self-possession. On December 3rd, 1861, at Boston's Tremont Temple, Frederick Douglass gave his, quote, lecture on pictures, which had been advertised under the title Pictures in Progress. His decision to talk about photography as the Civil War raged on was ill-received, but in the lecture, he set out an inventive philosophy of image making, arguing that the, quote, power to make and to appreciate pictures belongs to man exclusively. Photography democratizes, according to Douglass, quote, the process by which man is able to invent his own subjective consciousness into objective form. As art historian Sean-Michel Smith notes, Douglass's argument as a formerly enslaved man for objectification as the foundation of social progress is surprising. Yet he saw the alienation of self as object through photography as a potential means to claim a concrete form of self-possession. There are two or more makers of each photograph, the photographer and the subjects. Here, two women stand close, matching gold hoops threaded through their ears. The interview describes them as sisters named Pauline Johnson and Felice Boudreau, but who is whom in the photograph was never recorded. The sister on the right has stepped forward, holding an ornate crucifix in her left hand like an offering. The heavy metal of the cross drags its tip slightly to the side as she presents it. The woman on the left stands with her shoulder tucked slightly behind her sister's, a rosary in her hand as if in prayer. The text does not mention either object, presumably because in the mind of the interviewer, the crucifix and rosary lack a connection to slavery. However, the sisters explain the importance of the object is now lost, the only narrative preserved, visual and fragmentary. When we look at these photographs today, a multiplicity of pasts, intentionally recorded and not, become visible within their frames. Any of these photographs are fundamentally objects that exist because of the ability of the individuals pictured to persist. But as photo objects, creation continues beyond that initial impression. Each print accumulates different meanings as it travels through time and space, as messages are recorded on its back or when it is pasted into a page or deposited into a folder. To free the photographs from archival constraints, it's necessary to imagine alternate futures, both past and present. In her own study of a governmental archive, Tina Campt advances a Black feminist grammar of futurity as a, quote, politics of prefiguration, or a way of articulating, quote, that which will have had to happen, unquote, in order to will that future into being. For reparations to occur, I ask, how can the photographs of the WPA slave narratives be otherwise, both in their perception and material fact? How must they be otherwise for a more just future to arrive? Sorry. Grasped lightly in Willis Wynn's hand, the horn seems almost weightless. Solder marks show how the long flared instrument was joined together out of sheets of metal, perhaps tin judging by its sheen. Wynn addresses the camera, his expression quizzical, as though about to ask a question. The light is gentle, like sun in the early morning or the diffuse glow of a cloudy day. Sitting on the threshold of a cabin next to him is a jar of something, maybe polish, and a rag, as though he were about to shine the horn or else his boots before he put them on his feet. Unlike the majority of interviews where a single print represents the subject, two photographs of Wynn appear in the volume of narratives from Texas. The second is framed less tightly so that it registers more of the scene, and it seems like it might have been taken at a different date since the plants are dried and shiveled. He stands just off center in the frame with his hands on his pant legs. The brim of his hat casts a shadow over his eyes and the light seems harsher. Next to him, the horn stands upright, forming a triangle with a leaning collection of shovels and sticks. According to the written narrative, the overseer on the plantation where Wynn was enslaved used the horn to wake the bondspeople in the morning. From the interview, it is unclear how Wynn came to own the horn. It is also unclear what motivated him to keep the artifact and share it with curious visitors. In 1939, 2 years after the FWP interview was collected in 1937, a Farm Security Administration photographer, Russell Lee, took Willis Wynn's photo again. There are two different versions of Lee's portrait in the collection of the Library of Congress. In one, Wynne sits as though he is about to stand, the horn held in his hand again. His eyes slide to the side as if he is responding to another person just outside the frame. In the second, his body seems limp. The animating energy of the other portrait is gone. Horn laid across one leg, hand held loosely near his boot. His eyes are closed. It feels like a moment between poses. Russell Lee's photographs name Wynne and the horn simultaneously in the title, quote, "Old Negro, former slave, Willis Wynne, with horn with which slaves were called near Marshall, Texas," unquote. Each of the portraits pairs the former slave and the slave horn side by side so that the camera turns both into artifacts of the same institution. But even as the photographs frame the, quote, ex-slaves as artifacts, they capture both the individuals themselves and the possessions they retained as part of their personal history. Reading the objects that Wynne and others chose to include in the frame illuminates how the subjects used material property as well as posture and gesture to fashion the visual narratives of the photographs. The photographs are, in turn, owned objects, the image inseparable from the print's materiality. To follow Azoulai's call for reparations, I ask, how might scholars facilitate new relations between archival resources and the descendants of these individuals today? These photographs, redefined not as representing ex-slaves, but as affirming the lives of individuals, pose an opportunity to redistribute material and narrative possession. Highlighting the importance of ownership within their frames opens the possibility of those reparations. In other places, the presence of an artifact exceeds the descriptive force of the text. In a photograph taken in Lee County, Alabama, Lucindy Lawrence Jordan holds the center. She stands behind a spinning wheel and in front of a house, one finger on a spoke as though about to whirl it around. According to the written narrative, Jordan's mother initially used the wheel when she was enslaved on a plantation near Macon, Georgia. It had since come into the possession of Jordan's mother and then Jordan herself. Here, I quote the third-person narration that introduces the text of the interview. Quote, "Lucindy Lawrence Jordan bustled feverishly about her tiny Lee County cabin when she learned her picture was going to be taken. She got out her old spinning wheel, sat down before it and beamed. After she posed, she seated herself to tell about slavery days." In the photograph, Jordan is neither sitting nor beaming. She stands in the center of the frame, one hand behind her back. Eyes stare at the camera lens and her face is nearly expressionless. She seems to use the spinning wheel as a boundary between herself and the interviewer rather than an inviting display. Rather than beam, her face resists. The spinning wheel becomes a tense site of material negotiation between how the interviewer writer wants to characterize Jordan's experience and what she actually wants to share. The spinning wheel, as Jordan's inheritance, both ties her to enslavement and manifests her family's genealogy. Framed as an artifact of slavery, the wheel is also an artifact of generation. The photographer, likely the same person who interviewed Jordan, looked at her and the spinning wheel and saw the opportunity to create a single representative image of the, quote, former slave type the FWP wanted to preserve. Within a narrative of possession and inheritance, however, the photograph fulfills another purpose entirely. The interviewer asks about slavery, but not the decades of Jordan's life that followed. If Jordan was 79 in 1937, when she was interviewed, she was a 4-year-old child on January 1st, 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. What would her mother have done as a young woman so recently defined as property and who had a child in her care but did not herself own anything? She very likely might have claimed as her own the wheel upon which she had been forced to twist fiber into thread, to weave into fabric, to clothe other bondspeople and perhaps her enslavers too. She might have taken both the skill she had learned and the means to exercise it with her to spin yarn for cloth that she could sell. White thread winds between the wheel and spindle in the photograph. 3 figures are in the background, their faces obscured by the soft focus of the lens. But it is evident that even as the camera captured Jordan, their gazes captured the camera, captured the photographer, captured the scene. They stand like guardians at the top of 2 stairs. The interview does not mention these onlookers. How young is the child at the left? She might still suck her thumb, but she carries an even younger child in her arms. As the shutters clicked, the infant moved, throwing that side of the image into motion. A third of the girl's body did not make it into the frame, as though the photographer did not even realize she was part of the composition. The young woman on the right stands still, arms crossed. Her patterned, tailored dress and store-bought shoes contrast with the layers of cloth draped on Jordan's body and wrapped around her feet. A round straw hat frames the woman's face, and she seems ready to stay, to make sure everything is all right. Though Jordan's face resists, I wonder what this woman's expression might have said if the camera's focus had included her. She is hidden in plain sight. Are these Jordan's children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren? The wheel in this photograph spin a thread that reaches out beyond the moments of its making. In a final photograph, Mary Crane's expression is inscrutable, lips pursed and brows furrowed. The spotless gingham of her blouse glows. Sometime between 1937 and 1938, a man named Emery C. Turner took this photograph of Crane at her home in Mitchell, Indiana. A line at the bottom of Crane's narrative in the volume of interviews from Indiana notes that, quote, Mrs. Crane will also pose for a picture. Turner had to return specifically to take this photograph, it can be presumed. 3 photographs of other subjects were included in the volume eventually, but despite the note, this photograph was left loose in the collections of the Prints and Photographs division. As a result, a directive on its back is visible, quote, return to E.C. Turner, 714 Lincoln Avenue, Bedford, Indiana, unquote. Because so many pictures were pasted into the volumes, most portraits can only be interpreted through their image. This request for return is rare and its motivation unidentified. The scribbled instruction introduces the possibility of an alternate aborted history. Turner may have wanted the photograph for his own archive, or he may have wanted it for Crane. If the latter is true, and the photograph had been returned, it might now hang on the wall of a home belonging to one of Crane's descendants. Imagining such an alternate past for the photographs or an alternate future has stakes. The return of Crane's photograph would transform it from a document of categorization and control into a family photograph, a personal artifact. To close, I want to imagine another scene. Now, the photographs hang on a wall in an uneven series, separated by great expanses of space. Entering the gallery, the assemblage of images resembles a web more than an arrow. The photograph of Mary Crane hangs high in the top left corner. Some of the photographs have been enlarged, others are still snapshots, but they hang separately and together, the breadth of wall between them a present absence. This scene is not reality. The group of photographs I have chosen to discuss out of the many hundreds in the collection cannot currently be shown side by side. Many of them would have to be sliced from a page, would have to be sliced from the binding of the volumes. And all of the photographs are similarly small in size, though not identical. None are enlarged or framed. In this imagined exhibit, there are no new tombstone labels. The titles do not match the current entries for the photographs in the Library of Congress. The last line reads that each photograph is on loan from a family member of the person pictured. The photographs have been returned, the names and dates and home addresses included in the interviews used to track down descendants through long census searches. Just as the subject of each photograph exercised self-possession within the frame of the image, the photo objects themselves have been repossessed. By looking for the possibility of reparations in the archive, a range of alternate futures appears where documents present new beginnings rather than old endings. Thank you.
Thank you both Julia and Annie for your compelling presentations. At this time, I encourage anyone who has questions on either of the 2 presentations to ask their questions in the Q&A section at the bottom of the Zoom screen. Please make sure to be specific about which presenter your question is directed to.
If there aren't any audience questions right now, I actually have a question for Annie about her research. Okay. I was curious about the engravings that you mentioned at the end and their circulation and how that influenced how the pictures became known, because I've seen those photographs before, obviously, but I didn't know about their lives as daguerreotypes. And then I know there's been a lot of interesting research about like the transfer from a daguerreotype to print material. So I was curious if you had more comments on that.
Well, it's very hard to find any of the newspapers that actually have the reprinted woodcuts. But judging from how other photographs have been translated into that medium, it seems that it would alter the reception in terms it would make them darker than they actually appeared. And you would lose some of the definition in terms of their likeness. So it was not as an authentic likeness. You would still see them presented in terms of their the clothing that they chose to wear. So it was popular to send those images out through the colonization newspapers. However, Jane Roberts did not make it into the newspapers being a woman. So there was this gendered sort of situation going on where she spent all that time on her dress and everything else. And unfortunately for her, she was not pictured. But yeah, so they were translated into woodcuts, and then the woodcuts were put into the paper and somewhat altered the appearance. I really enjoyed your presentation, Julia. I had not heard of that archive, and that was fascinating. I think the different photographs you showed us.
Yeah, it's interesting. I've run into how I found it was I had run into citations to the narratives in a lot of different places for histories of enslavement. But then when I went to look at the collection, there were like 500 photographs and none of them are ever cited or included. So it seemed like an interesting oversight.
So it looks like there's a question. They wrote, "Thank you both for your presentations. For Annie, you discussed how the photographs highlighted Black identity by presenting the physical makeup like that of the sitter's facial structure. I was wondering if you have found this practice in photography rooted or related to the stereotyping of Black identity in America during this time, especially in painting."
I have not looked too much at painting because my focus is mainly on photography, but there was this very big focus on what we consider pseudoscience and looking into racial types and using not only the skull structure, but also the appearance of the bones in the face to categorize people, and not only on their physical appearance, but their intelligence and their moral character. So that's an interesting question. And actually, I would like to look into that in terms of portrait painting. And also, the other thing I'm thinking is that in terms of seeing African Americans in paintings, unfortunately, they're usually depicted as slaves or in the background of such paintings. So sometimes it's very difficult to see a close-up view of their face. But thank you, that's very interesting, and I will research that further.
There's another question for Julia. I was curious about the 115 age ascribed to the one slave. He certainly did not look or move like a 115-year-old. How would these ages be ascribed?
Yeah, thank you for that question. There are interesting sort of quirks of the archive like that. I think that the most likely answer is that when people were born under slavery, they didn't necessarily exactly know what year or time they were born. Often it was associated with like large meteorological or historical events. So people might have not known their own specific ages. Given the ways in which the editorial voice was exercised in the rest of the narratives, I haven't seen any proof of this, but I would question the accuracy of that and the source of that information. For every sort of snippet that you see in the actual Library of Congress archive, as I mentioned, there are like many layers of communication and editing that were usually not recorded, or if they are recorded, they're separately in state archives. So I haven't actually even been able to track down, partially because I haven't been able to actually go to the archive, how the photographs were named. I think that obviously when they're pasted in the book, they have the title of the person who was interviewed and their biographical information. But I don't know if that was done after the fact or how that information was preserved. Thank you.
There's another question for Julia. Your discussion of Charles Anderson and his military service is quite interesting, especially in light of the time of the WPA was published. Since this is following World War I and there were African-American troops that fought in this war also, do you think this may play a role in the editor's avoidance of speaking on Anderson's military service?
That's a super interesting question. I actually hadn't thought of it in that way. I mean, I think that for many different wars, there are different histories of Black Americans participating, coming home, thinking that they'll be accorded different rights of citizenship, and then being disappointed. So I would expect a huge part of the GAR was actually actively talking about Black service in the Union Army and actively recording the history of people who participated. So, I mean, that had been going on. The heyday of the GAR was in the 1890s when it had 40,000 members across the country. But it might have had a resurgence after World War I. I haven't seen anything to connect those two, though.
One more. This is for Julia also. Thanks for such a compelling presentation. Could you speak more how you came to your methodological approach and its relationship to Black feminist scholarship? I heard you mention Campton Sharp, but I also wonder about Saidiya Hartman, among others.
Yeah, thank you. Definitely. This is part of a larger project, so there's always some necessary pruning. I do talk about Saidiya Hartman in the larger project, and she actually talks specifically about the interviews at length in the introduction to Scenes of Subjection, because she uses them as one of the archival sources that she reads against the grain. And that's a book where she develops the idea of like critical fabulation as a necessary response to the archive's sort of absences and violences. But she doesn't talk about the photographs again. And so I think that there are places where, I mean, she's more of a historian and a scholar of English literature. And so there are places where people who don't work with objects like historians or don't work with them as much, they'll go to the text and they'll say, oh, well, there are these absences, like, what do we do with them? We can use critical storytelling, which is something that I've seen often in Black feminist thought. But then there's also this opportunity in this particular collection with the photographs where they're also fraught. They also have this ethnographic graze often at times. They're also taken by white photographers, but they do actually record the presence of the individual in the way that the interviews, because of the series of revisions, are kind of less trustworthy inherently. I mean, photographs also aren't really trustworthy, but there is a moment of encounter in every photograph. I guess that didn't, I mean, yeah, I was working with Sean Michelle Smith and Tina Campt and thinking about those questions. I was thinking about Bell Hooks's writing about the importance of representation in Black life and photography as personal galleries. And kind of trying to incorporate that into, I mean, I've been trying to be mindful of my own positionality in doing this project, and I want people to see the photographs and I want to write about them as a result. But I also think that the best that I can do is maybe suggest ways for dealing with them instead of make other assertions.
So at this time, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for the first day of our graduate student presentations. We hope that you'll be able to join us again tomorrow at 12:30. I want to remind everyone that there is a shift in schedule for tomorrow's program. Caroline Fucci will be presenting at 12:45 during the first session, and there'll be an updated schedule sent out to those who are registered. We all hope you have a great rest of your day and join us back here tomorrow using the same Zoom link.